An obese 17-year-old was rejected at auction until the most feared mountain man bought her. On a dusty street, a drunken father shoves his daughter before a jeering crowd. The auction bell clangs. Men laugh. No one will take her. Then, boots strike the dirt. A shadow falls. The most feared man in the mountains throws down gold and claims her with a single word. But he doesn't want a wife. He doesn't want a servant. He wants something far more dangerous. To save her. Now, as snow buries the highlands and whispers spread through town, the girl discovers strength she never knew she had. While the mountain man faces enemies ready to take his land, his freedom, and her very life. But when her own father returns with the railroad at his back, the truth will shatter everything. What happens when a girl everyone rejected becomes the only voice that can save the valley? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Sarah Ann Clyde stood frozen in the scorching August heat, her cotton dress damp with sweat as her father's fingers dug into her arm. The main street of Silver Bluff stretched before her like a golden ribbon under the merciless Colorado sun, lined with weathered storefronts and filled with townsfolk who had gathered to witness her shame. "Step right up, gents." Clyde's voice cracked through the afternoon air, whiskey rough and mean. "Got myself a fine worker here. Might not be much to look at, but she can cook and clean better than any." He yanked Sarah forward, making her stumble in the dust. The leather of her worn boots scuffed against the packed earth as she caught herself. Her cheeks burned hotter than the summer day as scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. She could feel their stares like physical things, sharp and cutting as the pebbles some of the younger boys had started tossing her way. "Ain't worth the feed it'd take to keep her," someone called out, triggering more cruel chuckles. Sarah pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it offered no protection from the barbs being hurled her way. Her fingers worked the frayed edge of the fabric, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of enduring her father's drunken rages. The familiar motion brought little comfort now. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "Please, Lord, have mercy." But mercy seemed in short supply in Silver Bluff that afternoon. The town marshal, Thompson, leaned against a hitching post near the general store, his badge catching the sunlight as he shifted his weight. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment before sliding away, disinterested. "Ain't my business," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Man's got his rights with his own kin." Clyde took another swig from his bottle, amber liquid dribbling down his unkempt beard. "Starting bid's $5, he announced, giving Sarah another rough shake. "That's a bargain for a girl who can make biscuits light as clouds and patch your clothes neat as you please." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle. Sarah recognized faces she'd known all her life. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who'd sometimes slipped her extra cornbread when things were lean. Mr. Parker, the shopkeeper who'd let her work odd jobs for penny candy as a child. Even Reverend Mills, who stood at the edge of the gathering with a troubled expression, but made no move to intervene. $3, someone called out mockingly. And that's being generous, considering how much she'd eat. Fresh laughter erupted, and Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her mother had always told her to hold her head high no matter what anyone said, but her mother was long gone now, leaving Sarah alone with a father who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be sold off. "Look at the size of her," another voice joined in. "You'd need a whole cow just to feed her for a week." More pebbles skittered across the dirt, one striking Sarah's ankle. She flinched but kept her eyes fixed on the ground, counting the drops of moisture that fell from her father's whiskey bottle to darken the dust at her feet. 1, 2, 3. Anything to distance herself from the mockery surrounding her. "Ain't no one here man enough to take her?" Clyde's voice had turned ugly, frustration bleeding through the false joviality. "She ain't pretty, but she's strong as an ox. Could help with the heavy work." "Rather hire the ox," someone shouted back, and the crowd roared with laughter. Sarah felt the trembling in her legs growing worse. The sun beat down mercilessly, and spots danced at the edges of her vision. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Clyde had finished the last of their food for breakfast, washing it down with the first of several bottles, and the heat was making her lightheaded. "Please, Pa," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can we go home now?" His fingers tightened painfully on her arm. "Shut your mouth, girl," he hissed. "Ain't going nowhere till we get this dealt with. Tired of feeding your worthless self?" The irony of his words, when she was the one who kept them both fed with her sewing money and odd jobs, wasn't lost on Sarah, but she knew better than to point it out. Instead, she retreated further into herself, letting the jeers and laughter wash over her like the wind that stirred the dust at her feet. $4, called out Billy Jenkins, the livery stable hand. His tone made it clear the bid wasn't serious. "But only if she comes with a reinforced wagon to cart her around in." Sarah recognized his voice. He'd asked her to the town social last spring, only to laugh in her face when she'd actually believed him. The memory of that humiliation mixed with the present one, making her stomach churn. A fresh volley of pebbles scattered around her feet, and someone started up a mocking song about a hefty heifer at the market. Sarah's vision blurred, but she forced the tears back. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She wouldn't. "Lord," she prayed silently, her lips barely moving, "if you're listening, please, please help me. I don't know what to do." But the only answer was more laughter, more jeers, more cruel suggestions about her worth, or lack thereof. The crowd had formed a loose circle around them now, faces she'd known all her life transformed by mockery and disdain. Even those who weren't actively participating stood by with amused smiles or carefully blank expressions. $2, another voice called out, "but only if she comes with a guarantee not to break my furniture." Clyde's grip tightened further, and Sarah bit back a whimper of pain. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, could feel the frustrated tension in his fingers. When no one made a serious bid, he'd likely drag her home and take out his anger on her, as he had so many times before. The sound of horses' hooves approaching from the north end of town barely registered through Sarah's fog of shame and fear. The crowd's attention remained fixed on the spectacle before them, on Clyde's increasingly desperate sales pitch and the continuing stream of mockery. "Last chance," Clyde bellowed, giving Sarah a shake that made her teeth rattle. "Ain't asking much for a good worker. She may be big as a barn, but she's strong as one too." "Ain't that the truth?" someone called back. "Looks like she could pull a plow better than my mules." Sarah closed her eyes tight, trying to remember her mother's words about dignity, about keeping faith even in the darkest times. But it was getting harder and harder to hold on to anything except the burning shame and the growing fear of what would happen when Clyde's patience finally ran out. The marshal shifted his weight again, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Reckon you'd best wrap this up, Clyde," he drawled. "Folk'll be wanting to get back to their business soon enough." Sarah felt a flutter of hope that the humiliation might be ending, only to have it crushed by her father's next words. "Not till I get rid of this burden," Clyde shouted, his words slurring more heavily now. "Come on, men. Surely one of you needs a strong back and a cooking woman. I'll take any offer." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the mockery. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's rejection, their collective judgment that she wasn't worth even the lowest bid. She wanted to sink into the ground, to disappear completely, to wake up and find this was all some terrible dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was her life, and it was happening right here in the dusty main street of Silver Bluff, under the scorching August sun, with every person she'd ever known watching her public humiliation. "Please," she whispered one last time, though she wasn't sure anymore if she was praying to the Lord or begging her father. "Please." The only response was another scatter of pebbles across the dirt and a fresh wave of laughter, as someone started up another verse of the mocking song about the hefty heifer. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching her tears darken the dust at her feet, each one a silent testament to her shame and the cruelty of those she'd once called neighbors. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Clyde's patience finally snapped. His face twisted with rage, and he yanked Sarah's arm hard enough to make her stumble. "Worthless," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Can't even fetch a decent price." His free hand drew back, and Sarah flinched, knowing what was coming. But the blow never landed. A sudden hush fell over the crowd, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear the creak of leather and the soft jingle of spurs as heavy boots stepped onto the packed dirt of the street. She dared to look up. Jonas McCord stood at the edge of the circle, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in worn buckskins that had seen countless mountain seasons, he cut an imposing figure against the afternoon sky. A long rifle was slung across his broad back, and a hunting knife hung at his belt. Deep scars crossed his weathered face, marks left by a grizzly's claws according to town gossip, though no one had ever dared to ask him directly. Sarah had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Silver Bluff knew of Jonas McCord. He came down from his cabin in the high country a few times each year to trade furs and buy supplies. Children were warned to stay clear of him, and grown men stepped aside when he passed. Stories of his violent past circulated in whispers around the saloon, tales of claim jumpers who disappeared after crossing him, of battles with hostile raiders, of winters spent alone in the savage wilderness. Now those fierce eyes swept over the scene before him, the jeering crowd, Sarah's tear-stained face, Clyde's upraised hand. His expression remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his gaze. The marshal straightened up, suddenly alert. Men who had been laughing moments before found urgent business elsewhere, edging away from the center of attention. Even the boys who'd been throwing pebbles melted back into the crowd. Clyde's hand slowly lowered, though his grip on Sarah's arm didn't loosen. He swayed slightly, caught between drunk bravado and instinctive fear. "Ain't your business, McCord," he managed to slur out, but his voice wavered. Jonas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that glinted in the sunlight. With deliberate slowness, he tossed it into the dust at Clyde's feet. The gold coin landed with a soft thud, spinning once before settling. "She's mine." Jonas's voice was low and gravelly, as if it had grown rusty from disuse. The words weren't a request or an offer. They were a statement of fact. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Women clutched their shawls closer, and men exchanged uneasy glances. What could the mountain man want with Sarah? The possibilities sparked dark whispers and concerned looks. Clyde stared at the coin, greed warring with fear on his face. "Now see here," he started. But Jonas cut him off with a single step forward. "Take it or leave it." The mountain man's hand hadn't moved toward any of his weapons, but something in his stance made it clear he was ready for trouble. Clyde's face worked through several expressions before settling on a mixture of relief and spite. He shoved Sarah roughly toward Jonas, nearly causing her to fall. "She's yours then," he spat, quickly snatching up the gold coin. "Good riddance to bad weight, I say." Sarah stumbled, catching herself just before she crashed into Jonas's chest. She could smell leather and wood smoke, and beneath that, the sharp tang of gun oil. Her heart hammered against her ribs as his large hand closed around her upper arm, not roughly like her father's grip, but firm enough to steady her. "Get her things," and Jonas commanded, his eyes never leaving Clyde. "Ain't got nothing worth taking," Clyde sneered, but he took an involuntary step back when Jonas's expression darkened. "Her mother's things," Jonas clarified, his voice growing even quieter, a warning sign that made several onlookers back away further. "All of them. Now." Clyde opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. "Fine," he muttered. "Wait here." He stumbled off toward their small house at the edge of town, leaving Sarah alone with her purchaser while the crowd watched in tense silence. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, trembling slightly. She'd been sold, just as her father intended, but to Jonas McCord of all people. The mountain man's reputation for violence was well known throughout the valley. What did he want with her? What would happen to her up in that lonely cabin in the high country? "Girl." Jonas's voice was quiet, meant for her ears alone. "Look at me." Slowly, fighting back tears, Sarah raised her eyes to meet his. The scars on his face were even more prominent up close, but his eyes weren't cruel, wary, certainly, hardened by years of solitude and survival, but not cruel. "You got a name?" he asked. Sarah," she managed to whisper. "Sarah Ann Clyde." He nodded once as if confirming something to himself. "Sarah," he repeated, and somehow the simple acknowledgement of her name felt different from how others said it. No mockery, no disdain, just recognition. The crowd continued to watch and whisper. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations. Poor thing. What's he wanting with her? Mountain man like that. Ain't natural. Jonas ignored them all, his attention focused solely on the return of Clyde, who came stumbling back with a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Here, Clyde thrust the package at Sarah. Your ma's fool trinkets. Now we're square. Sarah clutched the bundle to her chest, recognizing the familiar weight of her mother's Bible, the tin box that held her mother's wedding ring, and the carefully preserved daguerreotype of her parents in happier times. We're done, Jonas announced flatly, his tone brooking no argument. Come on, girl. He turned, guiding Sarah with that same firm but careful grip, and began walking toward where his horse was tethered at the edge of town. The crowd parted before them, no one daring to stand in Jonas McCord's way. Sarah heard her father's voice rise behind them, drunk and bitter. Hope you enjoy my worthless daughter, McCord. She ain't good for nothing except eating you out of house and home. Jonas didn't even pause in his stride, but Sarah felt his hand tighten slightly on her arm, not painfully, but as if he was restraining himself from turning back. They reached his horse, a sturdy mountain pony loaded with traded furs and supplies. Jonas helped Sarah mount, handling her weight easily and without comment, then swung up behind her. The saddle creaked as it adjusted to their combined burden. As they rode out of town, Sarah could feel the stares following them. She clutched her mother's bundle tighter, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. In the space of an hour, her life had changed completely. She'd been humiliated, auctioned, sold, and was now riding away with a man whose very name made people tremble. The last thing she heard as they left Silver Bluff behind was Billy Jenkins' voice, carrying on the wind. Reckon that's the last we'll see of either of them. Man like McCord, taking a girl like that up into the mountains. He left the rest unsaid, but the implications were clear in his tone. Sarah shuddered, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, falling unnoticed into the dust of the road leading up into the Colorado Highlands. The sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the quiet creaking of leather. Jonas hadn't spoken since they'd mounted up, and Sarah didn't dare break the silence. She watched as Silver Bluff grew smaller behind them, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. The bundle in her arms contained everything she had left in the world, her mother's few precious possessions and memories of a time when she'd known love and acceptance. Now she was heading into the unknown with a man whose reputation inspired fear throughout the territory. Sarah felt the trembling in her limbs growing worse as the reality of her situation truly began to sink in. But she forced herself to sit straight, to keep her chin up, just as her mother had always taught her. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with what dignity she could muster. Behind her, Jonas McCord remained silent, guiding the horse with sure hands up the trail that led toward the distant peaks where his cabin waited. The summer sun continued its slow arc across the sky, and Silver Bluff, with all its cruelty and rejection, gradually disappeared from view around a bend in the road. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as Jonas's mule plodded steadily away from Silver Bluff. Sarah perched awkwardly in front of Jonas on the saddle, her mother's bundle clutched tightly to her chest. The steady clip-clop of the mule's hooves and the creaking of leather were the only sounds breaking the heavy silence between them. The familiar buildings of town grew smaller behind them, and Sarah felt her racing heart begin to slow. The immediate terror of the auction was fading, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty about what lay ahead. She sneaked a glance over her shoulder at Jonas, but his weathered face revealed nothing as he guided the mule along the rocky path. The warm August breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, mingling with the leather and wood smoke smell of Jonas's buckskins. Sarah's legs were beginning to ache from the unfamiliar position in the saddle, but she didn't dare complain. The memory of her father's cruel words still rang in her ears, making her wonder if Jonas would regret his purchase just as quickly. After what felt like hours of tense silence, they approached a fork in the trail. One path led back toward town, while the other wound up into the highlands where Jonas made his home. The mule came to a stop without any visible signal from Jonas. Sarah's throat felt dry as sand as she gathered her courage. "Sir?" she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you mean to keep me?" Jonas's grunt held a note of surprise. "Keep you? His gravelly voice was harsh after the long silence. "I don't keep people, girl. You're free now." He gestured toward the trail leading back to Silver Bluff. "Town's that way if you want it." Sarah felt her heart plummet. She stared at the familiar path, remembering the jeers and stones, her father's drunken rages, the sideways glances and whispered insults that had followed her all her life. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, then found her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I have nowhere else to go. No friends, no kin but father, and he—" She swallowed hard. "He never wanted me. Never loved me like a father should." Jonas remained silent, but she felt him shift slightly in the saddle behind her. "I can work," she continued quickly, the words tumbling out. "I can cook real well and clean and mend clothes. I'm stronger than I look, despite—" She gestured vaguely at herself, shame coloring her cheeks. "I won't be a burden, I promise, just please don't send me back there." The mountain man let out a long sigh that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Life up in the highlands ain't easy, girl. Winters are harsh. Food's scarce sometimes. No fancy comforts, no neighbors to call on. Just work and solitude." He paused. "That's no life for a young woman." "It's better than what waits in town," Sarah replied softly but with conviction. "At least up there, no one will throw stones." Another long silence followed, broken only by the mule stamping impatiently and the call of a distant hawk. Finally, Jonas clicked his tongue, and the mule started forward again, taking the trail that led into the highlands. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonas's only response was a grunt, but he didn't turn the mule around. The sun was setting by the time they made camp in a small clearing near the foothills. Jonas helped Sarah down from the mule, his strong hands careful with her, as if she might break. Her legs trembled from the long ride, and she had to steady herself against the mule's warm flank. "Rest there," Jonas instructed, pointing to a fallen log. "I'll see to the animal and get a fire going." Sarah sank gratefully onto the log, watching as Jonas efficiently unpacked the mule and set up camp. His movements were practiced and economical, speaking of years spent in the wilderness. Soon a small fire crackled cheerfully in a ring of stones, pushing back the gathering darkness. Jonas pulled some jerky and a half loaf of bread from his supplies, dividing them carefully. He handed Sarah's portion to her without ceremony, then settled on the other side of the fire to eat his own share. The bread was slightly stale and the jerky was tough, but Sarah couldn't remember when food had tasted better. As she ate, she offered a silent prayer of thanks, not just for the meal, but for not being alone, for being away from her father's cruelty, for having a chance at something different, even if it meant living in the harsh wilderness with a man whose reputation inspired fear throughout the territory. The fire popped and crackled between them, sending sparks dancing up toward the emerging stars. Sarah finished her modest meal and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening air grew cooler. She could feel Jonas watching her from across the flames, his scarred face half in shadow. "You'll need proper clothes," he said abruptly. "Those town things won't last up in the highlands. We'll stop at the trading post tomorrow, get you some sturdy gear." Sarah nodded, surprised by this practical kindness. I don't have any money," she admitted. "Didn't ask if you did." Jonas tossed another stick onto the fire. "Can't have you freezing come winter. Bad enough having you up there at all without you dying of cold." "I won't be a burden," Sarah repeated firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "I mean to earn my keep." Jonas's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes seemed to soften slightly. "Get some sleep," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." He pulled a rolled blanket from his supplies and tossed it to her. Sarah caught it, feeling the rough wool between her fingers. It smelled of horses and smoke, but it was clean and warm. "Thank you," she said again for both the blanket and everything else left unspoken. Jonas simply nodded and turned his attention back to the fire. Sarah made herself as comfortable as she could on the soft grass, using her mother's bundle as a pillow and wrapping herself in the borrowed blanket. The ground was hard beneath her, so different from her narrow bed in town, but she felt safer than she had in years. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the darkness, A coyote called to its mate. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the strange night sounds of the wilderness. Across the fire, she could hear Jonas's steady breathing and the occasional soft clink as he cleaned his rifle. Despite her fears and uncertainties about what lay ahead, Sarah felt peace settling over her like a warm blanket. She was away from her father's fists, away from the town's cruel stares. Whatever hardships waited in the highlands, they couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. As sleep began to claim her, Sarah's lips moved in one final prayer of gratitude. The day that had started with such horror and shame had ended with an unexpected chance at a new life. She didn't understand why Jonas McCord had chosen to help her, but she silently vowed to prove worthy of his gruff kindness. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the quiet song of crickets and the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but for now, she was safe. She was fed, and she was no longer alone. The first rays of dawn crept through the pine trees, painting the mountain sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah stirred beneath the rough wool blanket, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. Every muscle protested as she sat up, unused to the previous day's long ride and the night spent outdoors. Jonas was already awake, crouched by a small morning fire with a tin cup of coffee in his weathered hands. He acknowledged her with a slight nod as she pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the soreness. "Sleep well?" he asked, his gravelly voice matching the morning quiet. "Yes, sir," Sarah lied, not wanting to seem ungrateful. In truth, every root and stone had seemed to find her through the blanket, and the night sounds had kept her half awake with their strangeness. Jonas grunted, clearly not believing her but choosing not to comment. He poured a second cup of coffee and held it out to her. Sarah took it carefully, warming her chilled fingers against the hot metal. The coffee was strong and bitter, but she sipped it gratefully, feeling its warmth spread through her. "Eat quick," Jonas said, passing her a piece of hardtack. "Got a long day ahead." Sarah nibbled at the tough bread while Jonas efficiently broke down their camp, his movements precise and practiced. When he finished loading the mule, he disappeared briefly into the trees and returned carrying a worn axe. Without ceremony, he held it out to her. "Take it," he said. "You'll need to earn your keep where we're going." Sarah stared at the axe, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. It looked heavy, and she worried her arms might not be strong enough to swing it properly. But she remembered her promise from the night before and reached out to take it. The weight surprised her, nearly pulling the axe from her grip. Jonas watched as she adjusted her hold, his expression unreadable beneath his graying beard. "Won't be easy," he warned. "But you said you were stronger than you look. Time to prove it." Sarah straightened her shoulders and nodded, determined not to show fear. "I'll learn, sir. I'll work hard." "Jonas," he corrected. "No need for her up here." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Sarah once again perched behind Jonas on the mule. The axe was secured alongside Jonas's rifle, its weight a constant reminder of the work ahead. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, winding through increasingly dense stands of pine and spruce. The air grew thinner, making Sarah's breath come faster, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they gained elevation. Around midday, they paused briefly to rest the mule and drink from a clear mountain stream. Sarah's legs trembled as she dismounted, and she had to steady herself against a tree. The water was ice-cold and sweet, nothing like the well water in town. "How much further?" she ventured to ask as they prepared to move on. "Be there by sunset," Jonas replied, checking the mule's lead rope. "Unless you're having second thoughts?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "No sight, Jonas, I'm not—" The afternoon wore on as they climbed higher into the highlands. The forest closed in around them, branches reaching across the narrow trail like grasping fingers. Sarah found herself ducking occasionally to avoid low-hanging limbs. The air grew cooler still, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and something wild and clean that she'd never smelled in town. The sun was indeed setting when Jonas finally reined the mule to a stop. Sarah peered around his broad shoulders and caught her first glimpse of his cabin. It stood in a small clearing, rough-hewn logs silvered by weather and age. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and Sarah wondered briefly who had kept the fire going while Jonas was in town. "Home," Jonas said simply, helping her down from the mule. Sarah's legs nearly buckled as she touched the ground, but she forced herself to stand straight. The cabin looked sturdy enough, if plain, with a small covered porch and 2 windows with wooden shutters. A lean-to shelter stood to one side, presumably for the mule and Jonas's gear. While Jonas took care of the animal, Sarah gathered her courage and approached the cabin door. It opened with a creak of leather hinges, revealing a space that was spare but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Stretched hides decorated the log walls, and she spotted a worn Bible resting on a crude shelf alongside a few other books. Tools hung from pegs in precise order, another axe, several knives, rope, and other implements she didn't recognize. A rough table with 2 chairs stood near the fireplace, and she spotted a cot in one corner. Everything spoke of utility and solitude with no concession to comfort or decoration. Jonas entered behind her, carrying their supplies. "Not much," he said, "but it keeps the weather out." He moved to the fireplace, stirring the banked coals and adding fresh wood until flames began to lick upward. Sarah stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, clutching her mother's bundle to her chest. "Where should I—" she began. Jonas pointed to the far corner where she now noticed a second cot folded against the wall. "That'll be yours. Best I can offer." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, moving to set up the cot. It was narrow and hard, but still better than the ground. She arranged her few belongings beside it, trying to take up as little space as possible. The cabin grew warmer as the fire caught properly. Jonas brought in more wood, stacking it neatly beside the hearth, then began unpacking supplies. Sarah watched him for a moment before squaring her shoulders. "I'll make supper," she offered. "You said you had beans?" Jonas nodded toward a sack near the fireplace. Sarah found a pot and began to work, determined to prove her worth. But her hands, still trembling from the long ride and the day's anxiety, betrayed her. As she measured the dried beans, several spilled across the rough wooden floor. Heat rushed to her face as she scrambled to gather them up. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I'll do better, I promise." "Beans is beans," Jonas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Floor's seen worse." Sarah managed to get the rest of the beans into the pot without incident, adding water and setting it to cook over the fire. She found salt and a few dried herbs in Jonas's stores and added them carefully, praying the meal would be edible. While the beans simmered, Jonas showed her where he kept the basic supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork, and other staples. Everything had its place, and Sarah tried to memorize the arrangement. The cabin might be sparse, but it was organized with careful precision. When the beans were finally ready, Sarah served them in tin bowls, setting one before Jonas with nervous hands. He ate without comment, neither praising nor criticizing. Sarah picked at her own portion, her appetite diminished by exhaustion and uncertainty. After the meal, Jonas showed her where to wash the dishes using water from a barrel outside. The night air was crisp, and Sarah shivered as she worked. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more than she'd ever seen in town. Back inside, Jonas added more wood to the fire while Sarah made up her cot. The rough blanket he provided smelled of pine smoke, but it was clean and warm. She changed quickly behind a crude screen Jonas had rigged up, grateful for even that small privacy. As she lay down, the wind began to rise outside, whistling through the pine trees and rattling against the cabin walls. The sound was eerie but somehow comforting, like a wild lullaby. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and Sarah could hear Jonas moving quietly around the cabin, checking things before settling onto his own cot. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and the occasional pop of the fire. The cabin creaked and settled around her, strange sounds that would take time to get used to. Yet beneath her uncertainty and the aches in her body, she felt an unfamiliar sensation: safety. Here, miles from town and her father's cruelty, surrounded by wilderness and in the company of a man feared throughout the valley, Sarah felt oddly protected. Jonas might be gruff and demanding, but he had shown her more kindness in one day than she'd known in years. The wind continued its wild song outside, but within the cabin's walls, Sarah finally felt her tensions begin to ease. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer of thanks. For the rough cot beneath her, for the warm fire, and for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this remote cabin in the highlands. Jonas's quiet breathing from across the room reassured her that she wasn't alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and hard work, but for now, she was sheltered from both the mountain weather and the cruelties she'd left behind in Silver Bluff. As she drifted off, Sarah realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she might belong somewhere. Dawn broke over the highlands with a pale golden light filtering through the pine branches. Sarah woke to find Jonas already up, the cabin's door open to the crisp mountain air. Her muscles ached from yesterday's ride, but she forced herself to rise quickly, not wanting to appear lazy. "Creek's quarter-mile down that trail," Jonas said, pointing through the doorway while sipping his coffee. "We need water." He handed her 2 wooden buckets, worn smooth from years of use. "Watch your step on them rocks." Sarah took the buckets and headed out, following the narrow path that wound down the slope. The morning air bit at her cheeks, and dew dampened the hem of her dress. She could hear the creek before she saw it, a clear rushing sound that grew louder as she descended. The creek ran swift and cold, its surface catching the early light. Sarah filled both buckets, the water so cold it made her hands ache. The trip back up proved far harder than going down. Water sloshed over her skirts as she struggled to keep her balance on the uneven ground. By the time she reached the cabin, her arms trembled from the weight. Jonas had stoked the fire and was setting out tools. "That's the first load," he said, taking one look at her dripping skirts. "We'll need more." 3 more trips left Sarah breathless, but she didn't complain. Each time she returned, Jonas had another task waiting. He showed her where he kept the kindling and handed her an axe that seemed impossibly heavy. "Smaller pieces catch better," he instructed, demonstrating the proper swing. "Mind your fingers." Sarah gripped the axe handle, its wood rough against her soft palms. The first few swings barely bit into the wood. She adjusted her stance, remembering how Jonas had done it, and tried again. The kindling split with a satisfying crack. As the morning wore on, blisters formed on her hands, but Sarah kept swinging. She noticed Jonas watching from the corner of her eye as he worked on mending a trap. His expression remained unreadable, but he didn't tell her to stop. By midday, Sarah had a decent pile of kindling and an impressive collection of blisters. Jonas gestured for her to tend to the stew pot hanging over the fire. She added dried meat and the vegetables they'd brought from town, grateful for a task that didn't require gripping an axe handle. The afternoon brought laundry, her own few things and some of Jonas's shirts that needed mending. She hung them on a line stretched between 2 pines, using wooden pins to secure them against the mountain breeze. The work kept her moving, kept her from dwelling on everything she'd left behind in Silver Bluff. The weather changed quickly in the highlands. Sarah was checking the drying laundry when she felt the first drop of rain. Looking up, she saw dark clouds rolling down the mountainside like a gray avalanche. The temperature dropped sharply as she rushed to gather the clothes before they got soaked again. The ground had turned treacherous, slick with sudden rain. Sarah's foot slipped in the mud as she reached for the last shirt. She felt herself falling, but before she could hit the ground, a strong hand gripped her arm. Jonas had appeared beside her, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Stubborn as a mule," he muttered, but there was something almost like approval in his tone. Together they rescued the remaining laundry, just as the storm hit in earnest. Inside the cabin, Sarah worked on the evening meal while rain drummed against the roof. The stew bubbled slowly over the fire, filling the space with savory smells. She'd added extra herbs she'd noticed growing near the cabin's door, hoping to prove she could do more than just warm up beans. When she served the stew, Jonas took a careful spoonful. Sarah held her breath, watching his face. After a moment, he gave a slight nod, just a small gesture, but Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at this silent approval. That night, kneeling beside her cot, Sarah whispered her prayers into the darkness. She thanked God for the strength to lift those buckets, for the determination to keep swinging the axe, for the small nod over dinner that meant she wasn't entirely useless. Her hands stung from the blisters, and her back ached fiercely, but for the first time in years, she felt she might be earning her place somewhere. 2 days passed like water over stones in the creek. Down in Silver Bluff, the late summer heat drew men to gather outside Thompson's general store, seeking shade and spreading stories between sips from tin cups. "Heard tell McCord's keeping that Clyde girl up in his cabin," drawled Pete Miller, a weathered miner with coal-stained fingers. "Ain't natural, a man his age with a young thing like that." The other miners nodded, their faces dark with judgment. Some spat tobacco juice into the dust, while others crossed their arms and frowned. The story had grown with each telling, spinning out like a spider's web across the town. Reverend Matthews stood at the edge of the group, his collar wilting in the heat. "Without proof of sin we cannot condemn," he said, though his brow furrowed with concern. "Still, it bears watching. The girl had no proper ceremony, no blessing of marriage." Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Sarah and Jonas moved through their days in a rhythm as steady as the sun's path across the sky. The cabin slowly transformed under Sarah's careful attention. She'd mended the torn curtains hanging crooked at the windows, patched Jonas's worn shirts, and learned to cook meals that earned more than just nods of approval. That afternoon, Jonas found Sarah by the creek, setting traps as he'd shown her. Her movements were careful but growing more confident with each try. He watched her work, noting how she'd stopped jumping at every forest sound. "Time you learned something else," Jonas said, holding out his long rifle. Sarah's eyes widened at the offer. The weapon was as much a part of Jonas as his buckskins. She'd never seen him let anyone else touch it. "Stand here," he instructed, positioning her near a fallen log. "Sight down the barrel, like you're threading a needle." His gravelly voice was patient as he showed her how to hold the rifle properly. Sarah's arms trembled under the weapon's weight. She pressed it against her shoulder as Jonas had shown her, squinting at the crude target he'd marked on a distant tree. The trigger felt cool under her finger. The rifle's report cracked through the mountain air like thunder. Sarah stumbled backward from the recoil, but instead of crying out in fear, she burst into laughter, a clear, bright sound that echoed off the rocks. Jonas's eyebrows rose in surprise at her reaction. "Land's sake," she exclaimed, rubbing her shoulder but still grinning. "That's quite a kick." For a moment, Jonas's stern face softened. "Again," he said, helping her reload. "This time, lean into it." As evening settled over the highlands, they returned to the cabin. Sarah moved about the kitchen, preparing their supper with growing ease. The familiar tasks felt nothing like the forced labor of her father's house. Here, each action had purpose, earned its own respect. Night drew its dark curtain across the mountains. Sarah sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of Jonas's wool socks. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their wild voices rising and falling like eerie music. Time was when those sounds would have sent shivers down her spine, but now they felt as natural as the crackle of the fire. She glanced at Jonas, who sat cleaning his rifle with practiced motions. His scarred face was stern as ever, but something had changed in the air between them. The silence they shared was comfortable now, like a well-worn blanket. Sarah threaded her needle again, remembering how she'd once been as scared of Jonas as she was of the coyotes. Now, with him nearby, she felt no fear at all, only a growing sense that she might have finally found her place in the world. The first frost came early that year, painting the highlands in crystalline white. Sarah woke to find her breath visible in the cabin's chill air. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she hurried to stoke the dying embers. Her fingers, still tender from weeks of work, ached in the cold. Jonas stood at the window, his weathered face etched with concern as he studied the gray sky. "Winter's coming fast this year," he said, his voice low. "Supplies won't last if we don't hunt soon." Sarah nodded, adding another log to the fire. Their stores had dwindled faster than expected. She'd learned that mountain life demanded more food than town living ever had. The shelves that had seemed so full in summer now showed worrying gaps. "I could help," she offered, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. She'd been practicing with the rifle whenever Jonas would spare the ammunition, and her aim had improved. Jonas turned from the window, studying her with those keen eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's core. After a long moment, he gave a single nod. "Reckon it's time you learned proper hunting. Get your warm things on." Sarah's heart leaped. She hurried to layer herself in the wool stockings and heavy skirt she'd mended for winter. Over these went the buckskin jacket Jonas had given her, made for a smaller man. It fit her surprisingly well. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled on her boots, not entirely from the cold. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they stepped outside. A thin layer of frost crunched beneath their feet, and the pine branches hung heavy with crystalline needles. Sarah followed Jonas's lead, trying to match his quiet stride as they moved into the forest. "First rule of hunting," Jonas whispered, his breath clouding in the air, "is patience. Second is silence." He demonstrated how to place each foot, rolling from heel to toe to minimize noise. Sarah copied his movements, conscious of every twig and leaf beneath her boots. They walked for nearly an hour, climbing higher into the timber where the frost lay thicker. Sarah's legs burned from the effort, and sweat dampened her back despite the cold. Still, she kept pace, determined not to show weakness. Jonas stopped suddenly, raising one hand. Sarah froze mid-step, hardly daring to breathe. Through the trees ahead, something moved. A snowshoe rabbit, its coat already turning white for winter. It sat alert, ears twitching, unaware of their presence. With agonizing slowness, Jonas handed Sarah the rifle. "Remember what I taught you," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Breathe steady, squeeze gentle." Sarah raised the rifle, trying to still her trembling arms. The rabbit seemed impossibly small in the sight. Her heart thundered so loud she feared it would startle the creature. She drew a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning stillness. Birds exploded from nearby branches in a flutter of wings. When the echo faded, Sarah saw the rabbit lying still in the snow. "Good shot," Jonas said simply, but his approval warmed her more than any fire could have. Walking to retrieve her kill, Sarah felt an unexpected wave of emotion. The rabbit lay peaceful, as if sleeping, its blood bright against the frost. She'd never taken a life before, not even an animal's. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. "It's natural to feel that way," Jonas said quietly behind her. "Shows respect for the life given, but this is how we survive up here." He showed her how to field dress the rabbit properly, his movements quick and efficient. Nothing goes to waste. That's the mountain way. Sarah nodded, watching carefully. The reverence in Jonas's movements helped ease the ache in her heart. This wasn't sport or cruelty. It was survival, as much a part of mountain life as chopping wood or hauling water. They continued hunting through the morning, taking 2 more rabbits. Sarah's confidence grew with each success, though she said a silent prayer of thanks for each life taken. The sun had climbed high, warming the frost to dew, when Jonas suggested they head back. The return trip felt different. Sarah walked taller, proud of her contribution to their winter stores. Even the weight of the rabbits in her game bag couldn't dampen her spirit. Jonas walked beside her now rather than ahead, a subtle shift that spoke volumes about her growing competence. But as they approached the cabin clearing, Jonas's demeanor changed. His stride shortened, his shoulders tensed. Sarah followed his gaze to the ground near their woodpile and felt her own muscles tighten. There, in the softening frost, were boot prints, too large to be hers, too fresh to be Jonas's from that morning. "Someone's been here," she whispered, suddenly conscious of how exposed they were. Jonas nodded grimly. "More than one." He pointed out several sets of tracks, showing her how to read their story. 3 men, armed by the way they stood, came from the valley trail. He circled the cabin carefully, rifle ready, before allowing Sarah to enter. Nothing inside had been disturbed, but the knowledge that strangers had stood so close to their home sent chills down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. That evening, as Sarah prepared the rabbit stew, she noticed subtle changes in Jonas's behavior. He cleaned his rifle with extra care, checked the cabin's heavy door bar twice, and kept glancing out the windows into the gathering dusk. The easy comfort of their shared routine had been replaced by a watchful tension. Sarah knew some of Jonas's history. Everyone in the valley did. He'd earned his fearsome reputation in younger days, driving out claim jumpers and surviving situations that had killed other men. She'd seen how people in town drew back when he passed, how they whispered behind their hands. But here in the cabin, she'd come to know a different man, one who taught her patiently, who approved her efforts with quiet nods, who never once mocked her size or her struggles. Now, watching him move restlessly around their small home, she glimpsed the weight he carried. To be feared was to be hunted, to live always watching over one's shoulder. The tracks outside were more than just footprints. They were a reminder that the world beyond their mountain haven had not forgotten Jonas McCord. As darkness settled fully outside, Sarah knelt beside her cot as she did every night. But instead of silent prayers, she spoke aloud, her voice soft but clear in the cabin's warmth. "Dear Lord," she began, feeling Jonas's attention shift to her, though he didn't turn from the window. "Thank you for this day's provision, for teaching me to be useful, for giving me strength to do what needs doing." She paused, then continued with deeper feeling. "Please watch over this cabin and those within it. Protect us from those who mean us harm. And thank you, Lord, for bringing me here, to this place, and this—" She hesitated only briefly. "This family." The word hung in the air between them. Sarah remained kneeling, eyes closed, letting the crackle of the fire fill the silence. She heard Jonas shift his weight, the boards creaking beneath his feet, but he said nothing. When she finally rose and turned toward him, he still stood at the window, his scarred profile outlined by firelight. But something in his stance had softened, almost imperceptibly. His rifle rested against the wall now instead of in his hands. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Sarah added another log to the fire, its warm light pushing back the shadows. The tracks outside might mean trouble coming, but in this moment their cabin felt like a sanctuary, not just for her but for Jonas too. As she settled onto her cot, pulling the heavy quilt up against the night's chill, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day in town. She'd learned to split wood, to shoot straight, to read weather and tracks to make a home in this wild place. But perhaps the most important lesson had been about family, how it could be found in unexpected places, built not from obligation, but from choice. Jonas moved away from the window at last, settling into his chair by the fire. The familiar scents of wood smoke and rabbit stew filled the cabin. Sarah's prayers seemed to linger in the air, a shield of sorts against whatever threats those tracks might herald. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thought as the fire burned low. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Winter was coming, and now they knew they weren't as alone in these highlands as they'd thought. But for tonight they were warm, fed, and together. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the fire's warmth and Jonas's solid presence lull her toward sleep. The last thing she saw before drifting off was Jonas adding another log to the fire, his movements careful and quiet, watching over their mountain home as the night deepened around them. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a week after they'd discovered the mysterious tracks. Sarah stood at the cabin's wooden wash basin, scrubbing yesterday's cooking pot when she heard the distinct crunch of boots on gravel. Her hands stilled in the soapy water. Jonas, who had been mending a trap near the door, was already on his feet, rifle in hand. 4 men emerged from the tree line into their clearing. They wore city clothes, clean shirts and polished boots that marked them as strangers to mountain life. One carried a leather satchel stuffed with papers, while another held surveying equipment Sarah had seen used when the railroad came through Silver Bluff. "This the McCord place?" The man with the satchel called out, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that seemed out of place against the pine-scented air. Jonas stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casual but ready. "You're trespassing." The man with the satchel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled out several official-looking documents, holding them up like a shield. "Actually, Mr. McCord, we're here on legitimate business. I'm Herbert Wells, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company. These are our surveyors." He gestured to his companions. "We're here about the spring." Sarah's heart quickened. The spring was their lifeblood, clear, sweet water that never failed, even in the driest seasons. She moved closer to the cabin door, staying just inside where she could hear everything. "Spring's mine," Jonas said flatly. "Been mine 20 years. Wells shook his head, still wearing that empty smile. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate. According to these documents, the railroad holds mineral and water rights throughout this sector, signed by the territorial governor himself." He took a step forward, rustling his papers. "We're planning a depot in the valley. That spring is vital to our operations." Jonas's voice grew harder. "Don't much care what your papers say. This is my land, my water. Been here since before your railroad was more than a dream in some rich man's head. Now, Mr. McCord, Wells said, his tone becoming less friendly. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The railroad's coming. Progress can't be stopped. Why not be reasonable? Reasonable would be you turning around and heading back down that mountain, Jonas replied. His finger rested alongside his rifle's trigger guard, not threatening, but clear enough. The surveyors shifted uncomfortably, but Wells stood his ground. We have the law on our side, Mr. McCord. These documents mean nothing up here, Jonas cut him off. This is my land, my spring. Now get off it. Wells's fake smile finally dropped. We'll return with the sheriff, Mr. McCord. Make this official. He carefully tucked his papers away. Don't do anything foolish in the meantime. The railroad doesn't take kindly to interference with its legal rights. And I don't take kindly to thieves in fancy boots, Jonas replied evenly. The threat hung in the air between them. Finally, Wells nodded curtly and gestured to his men. They retreated back into the trees, their surveying equipment catching sunlight as they disappeared. Sarah waited until their footsteps had faded before stepping onto the porch. Jonas? Her voice quavered slightly. What does it mean? He stood silent for a long moment, still watching the tree line. Finally, he lowered his rifle. Means trouble's found us, girl. Inside the cabin, Jonas paced while Sarah tried to keep her hands steady enough to make coffee. The morning's confrontation had left them both unsettled. The spring feeds more than just us, Jonas explained, his voice rough with emotion Sarah had never heard before. Water runs down, feeds creeks all through the valley. Ranchers depend on it. Small farmers, too. He paused by the window, looking out toward where the spring bubbled up from the earth. Railroad gets control, they'll dam it up, save it all for their steam engines. Valley folks will suffer. Sarah set 2 tin cups of coffee on the table. But surely they can't just take it, you've been here so long. Jonas turned to her, his scarred face grave. Railroad's got money, girl. Money buys paper, paper buys law. He sat heavily in his chair. Been seeing it all over the territory. Small holders pushed out, water rights stolen, all in the name of progress. It isn't right, Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with her own conviction. The Lord gave this water to all his creatures, not just for railroad companies to steal. Jonas made a sound that might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Lord seems to favor those with the most gold in my experience. No, Sarah insisted, her voice stronger now. The Lord favors the righteous. David defeated Goliath not because he was stronger, but because his cause was just. She met Jonas's skeptical gaze. God will not let greedy men prevail, not if we stand firm in faith. Jonas studied her for a long moment. The hardness in his eyes softened slightly, though he shook his head. Your faith is a fine thing, girl. But faith alone won't stop the railroad, or the sheriff when he comes. Sarah's hands clasped together in her lap. Then we'll face them with both faith and courage. You taught me to shoot straight and stand tall. God will do the rest. Outside, wind stirred the pines, carrying the eternal song of the spring, the water that had drawn Jonas here 2 decades ago, that had sustained this land and its people through drought and hardship. The same water that now threatened to bring their peaceful life crashing down. Sarah rose and moved to the stove, where a pot of beans had been soaking since morning. She added them to the cooking pot, along with a handful of dried herbs. The familiar tasks helped steady her hands, but her mind churned like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. Jonas cleaned his rifle with methodical care, each movement practiced and precise. The familiar scritch-scritch of the cleaning rod punctuated the silence between them. Sarah knew he was preparing. For what exactly, she wasn't sure. But the tension in his shoulders spoke of battles fought long ago, of a violence he'd tried to leave behind. The beans began to simmer, filling the cabin with their homey scent, but neither Sarah nor Jonas seemed to notice. Each was lost in their own thoughts, weighing what might come. Sarah's prayers mixed with the bubble of the cooking pot and the whisper of the wind, asking for guidance, for protection, for the strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The afternoon light slanted golden through the cabin's windows, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold knot of worry in Sarah's stomach. She'd found safety here, a home, a father in all but blood. The railroad's threats weren't just about water rights. They threatened everything she and Jonas had built together. Jonas finally set his rifle aside, the metal gleaming with oil. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "you don't have to stay. Could be things get ugly." Sarah straightened her spine, chin lifting in the way she'd learned from him. "This is my home too now. I'm not running." A ghost of a smile touched Jonas's weathered face. "Stubborn as a mule," he muttered, but there was pride in his voice. She stirred the beans, adding a pinch more salt. "We'll need our strength," she said simply. "Best eat well tonight." The cabin grew darker as evening approached. Neither lit the lamp, letting the shadows gather like their own dark thoughts. The spring's endless song drifted through the windows, a reminder of what they stood to lose. Not just water, but a way of life, a home built on trust and quiet acceptance. Sarah dished out 2 bowls of beans, the steam rising like prayer into the gathering dusk. They ate in silence, each bite a defiance against those who would drive them from this mountain sanctuary. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Storm clouds were gathering, both in the sky and in their hearts. But they would face them together. Jonas's spoon scraped the bottom of his bowl. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow's soon enough to worry." But Sarah knew neither of them would sleep easily this night, their thoughts too full of railroad men and legal papers, of sheriffs and water rights, of battles yet to come. She said her prayers as always, adding special petitions for wisdom and protection. From his chair by the window, Jonas listened in silence, his face carved in shadow, watching over their threatened home as darkness claimed the mountain. The first snowflakes drifted down like feathers, soft and innocent. By nightfall, the storm had grown into a howling beast that shook the cabin walls. Sarah stood at the window, watching the white darkness swallow their world. The firewood they had stacked seemed plenty before, but now she wondered if it would last. Jonas stomped in from the lean-to forge, bringing a blast of cold air with him. His beard was crusted with ice, his hands red from working metal in the bitter cold. "Storm's settling in," he said, hanging his heavy coat by the door. "Might be here a while." Sarah nodded, already moving to stoke the fire higher. "Soup's still warm if you're hungry." He grunted appreciation, but went first to check their supplies, counting portions of dried meat, beans, and flour with careful precision. Sarah had learned this habit of his, always preparing for the worst. Now she understood why. Days blurred together as the storm raged. The snow piled higher, until the window showed nothing but white. Their world shrank to the cabin's 4 walls, the constant wind their only visitor. Jonas spent hours at his forge in the lean-to, hammering out repairs to traps and tools. The rhythmic clang of his work carried through the walls, a heartbeat in their isolated world. Sarah established her own rhythm. She kept the fire fed, cooked their careful rations, and spent long hours by the hearth with needle and thread. Her fingers, once clumsy with such work, had grown sure over the months. She mended Jonas's worn shirts, patched her own skirts, and even attempted to craft new items from scraps of cloth and leather. Waste not, Jonas had taught her, and she took pride in making old things useful again. The firelight flickered over her work as she sewed, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Sometimes she sang hymns softly, her voice barely audible over the storm's moan. On the 4th day, Jonas came in later than usual, his movements slow with exhaustion. "Need to check the roof supports," he muttered, reaching for his coat again. "Snow's getting heavy." "You've been out all day," Sarah protested. "At least eat something hot first." But Jonas was already pushing back into the storm. Sarah heard him moving above, clearing snow from the roof. The wind had picked up again, driving ice crystals like needles. She paced, worry gnawing at her stomach until finally the cabin door opened again. Jonas stumbled in, covered in snow and shivering violently. Sarah rushed to help him with his coat, alarmed by how heavily he leaned against her. His skin burned against her hand when she touched his face. "You're burning up," she said, fear tightening her throat. "Come to the fire." "Just need rest," he mumbled, but his legs gave out. Sarah barely managed to help him to his bed, her heart pounding with terror. She had never seen him weak before. He had always been as solid as the mountain itself. Through the night, Jonas's fever raged. Sarah kept the fire blazing, melted snow for cool cloths to lay on his forehead, and prayed harder than she ever had before. She made broth from their precious stores of dried meat, coaxing spoonfuls between his cracked lips. "Can't lose you," she whispered, wiping his face with trembling hands. "Please, Lord, don't take him from me now." Jonas tossed in delirium, muttering about past battles, old wounds, lost friends. Sometimes he called out in fear or anger, fighting enemies only he could see. Sarah spoke softly to him, trying to anchor him to the present with her voice. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Sarah moved through endless hours of tending the fire, melting snow, checking Jonas's fever, and praying. She dozed in short snatches, jerking awake at every change in his breathing. Their supplies dwindled as days passed, but she couldn't think about that now. Nothing mattered except keeping Jonas alive. On the third night of his fever, Jonas grew restless again. Sarah hurried to his side with a fresh, cool cloth. His eyes were open, but unfocused, still caught in fever dreams. "Careful, daughter," he mumbled, reaching for her hand. "Mountains treacherous in storm." Sarah froze, the cloth dripping forgotten in her grip. "Daughter," she whispered. "Keep you safe," Jonas continued, his burning hand squeezing hers. "My girl. My daughter." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, falling unnoticed onto their clasped hands. All her life, she had been unwanted, a burden, a shame, something to be sold off or cast aside. But here, in this storm-wrapped cabin, this fierce mountain man had claimed her, called her daughter, wanted to keep her safe. "I'm here," she managed through her tears. "Rest easy, Father." The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. She had never dared use it before, even in her deepest prayers, but now it felt right, as if God himself had ordained this moment. Jonas's eyes drifted closed again, but his grip on her hand remained strong. Sarah sat beside him through the long hours, tears flowing freely as she whispered prayers of gratitude. The storm still raged outside, but in her heart a different storm had finally calmed. Dawn brought the first break in Jonas's fever. His eyes opened, clear and aware for the first time in days. Sarah was dozing in her chair beside him, her hand still holding his. "Sarah?" His voice was weak but lucid. She startled awake. "Jonas, how do you feel?" "Like I wrestled a bear," he groaned, trying to sit up. "How long?" "4 days," she said, helping him lean against the wall. "The fever was bad. I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jonas looked around the cabin, taking in the carefully maintained fire, the stack of melted snow water, the evidence of her constant care. His eyes came back to her face, noting the exhaustion and worry etched there. "You kept me alive," he said simply. Sarah busied herself getting him broth, hiding fresh tears. "The Lord heard my prayers." "The Lord worked through your hands," Jonas countered quietly. "You're stronger than you know, girl." She brought him the broth, supporting the cup as he drank. Neither mentioned what had passed in his fever dreams, but something had shifted between them, subtle as snowfall but just as transformative. Over the next days, Jonas regained his strength slowly. Sarah kept him in bed despite his protests, insisting he rest until the fever was truly gone. She told him stories as she worked, bits of her past she had never shared before. Her mother's death, her father's descent into drink, the lonely years of mockery and shame. Jonas listened in silence, his eyes dark with understanding. When she finished, he spoke of his own battles, the violence that had marked him, the solitude he had chosen to protect others from his reputation. They shared their burdens in the quiet hours while outside the storm gradually spent its fury. Finally, the snow stopped. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, making the cabin glow. Sarah opened the door to a transformed world. Everything familiar made new under deep white drifts. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a perfect blue. Jonas stood beside her, still pale but steady on his feet. "Beautiful," he said softly, "but deadly. Winter's just beginning up here." Sarah nodded, understanding now why he had driven himself so hard to prepare. "We'll be ready," she said firmly. "Together." He glanced at her, something warm in his eyes. Together, he agreed. They had work ahead. Paths to clear, supplies to check, steps to strengthen against the weight of snow. But they would face it as family now, bound by something stronger than blood or law. The mountain had tested them, and in surviving they had found truth. Love could grow even in the harshest soil, if tended with faith and courage. Sarah took a deep breath of the crystal air, her heart full of gratitude. The winter ahead would be hard, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her place, her purpose, her father. God had led her to this mountain for a reason, and she would make herself worthy of his gift. Jonas touched her shoulder briefly, then turned back to the cabin's warmth. "Come on, daughter," he said gruffly. "Days wasting." Sarah followed him inside, joy rising in her chest like a hymn. The word, daughter, rang in her ears, precious as gold, solid as stone. At last, she was claimed. At last, she was home. The January sun hung pale and weak in the Colorado sky, offering little warmth to the snow-covered highlands. A brief thaw had loosened winter's grip, though ice still claimed most surfaces. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped carefully down the path to the creek, carrying Jonas's axe and a wooden bucket. The creek gurgled beneath its frozen armor, reminding her of hymns sung in church back in Silver Bluff. Sarah missed the music sometimes, though not the judging stares that had always accompanied it. Here, the mountain's silence held its own kind of reverence. She studied the creek's surface, looking for the safest spot to cut ice. Jonas had taught her well. Check the thickness first, listen for warning cracks, stay close to the bank. The thought of Jonas made her glance back toward the cabin. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney, telling her he had managed to keep the fire going. His fever had broken weeks ago, but weakness still dogged his steps. Sarah set her bucket down and gripped the axe firmly. The first blow rang out sharp in the winter air. She worked steadily, careful not to strain herself, letting the axe's weight do most of the work. Chips of ice scattered around her boots as she carved out a rectangular block. "Steady now," she muttered to herself, hearing Jonas's voice in her head. She had learned to talk to herself up here, finding comfort in breaking the mountain silence. The ice block loosened, and she worked it free with practiced movements. The bucket was half full when she heard boots crunching on snow. Jonas stood at the top of the path, leaning on his rifle like a walking stick. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were alert as ever. "You shouldn't be out here," Sarah called, worry creasing her brow. "The air's too cold for your chest." "Can't stay cooped up forever," Jonas replied, his voice still rough from illness. He made his way carefully down to her, and Sarah noticed how he tried to hide his breathlessness. "Besides, someone needs to watch your back while you work." Sarah knew better than to argue. Instead, she shifted slightly, making room for him to settle on a fallen log nearby. They had developed this dance over the past months, her caring for him while pretending not to, him protecting her while claiming he was just getting fresh air. "Tell me about your trapping days," Sarah said as she returned to her ice cutting. She had learned that stories kept Jonas still when he might otherwise push himself too hard. "You mentioned that spot up by Eagle's Ridge once." Jonas was quiet for a moment, and Sarah worried he might refuse. He rarely spoke of his past, but his fever dreams had loosened something in him. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Was up there in '58, he began, his voice low and measured. "Hard winter, like this one. Had me a good line of beaver traps along the ridge stream." He paused, watching Sarah work. "That's where I first ran into claim jumpers." Sarah listened intently as Jonas described the confrontation, 3 men trying to steal his furs and traps. His voice held old anger, but also something else. Regret, maybe. "Didn't want to hurt anyone," he continued. "But up here, a man's work is his life. They drew first." He fell silent, and Sarah knew he was seeing those moments again, reliving choices made in snow and darkness. "You did what you had to," she said quietly, setting another block of ice in her bucket. "To survive." Jonas nodded slowly. "Always figured that's why folks down in Silver Bluff look at me sideways. Word gets around. Man defends himself enough times, gets a reputation." Sarah straightened, pushing hair from her face with her sleeve. "Those folks don't know you," she said firmly. "They don't see how you teach instead of threaten, how you help instead of harm." A ghost of a smile touched Jonas's weathered face. "Reckon you see more than most, girl." They fell into comfortable silence as Sarah finished filling her bucket. Jonas stood with effort, reaching for the handle, but Sarah got there first. "I've got it," she said. "You can carry the axe." Inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Sarah set about breaking the ice into smaller pieces for their icebox while Jonas added wood to the fire. The domestic quiet reminded her of earlier days before her mother's death, when home had meant safety instead of fear. "My mama used to sing while she worked," Sarah said suddenly. The words surprised her. She rarely spoke of her mother, but something about this peaceful afternoon made it feel right. She knew all the old hymns and some folk songs too, said music made the work lighter. Jonas settled in his chair by the fire, watching her with quiet attention. Sarah's hands kept moving as she spoke, breaking ice, her voice soft with memory. "She taught me to cook, to mend, to keep house proper, said a woman's hands should always be busy with good work." Sarah paused, blinking back sudden tears. After the fever took her, nothing was the same. Father started drinking heavy. Couldn't bear to look at me, said I reminded him too much of her. "Some men can't carry their grief right," Jonas observed. "Turn it mean instead of sad." Sarah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I used to pray he'd find his way back to the man he was. Still do sometimes." The afternoon light began to fade, bringing Sunday's early winter dusk. Sarah lit the lamp and reached for Jonas's Bible, worn smooth with age. It had become their custom lately, her reading aloud while Jonas listened. She settled in her chair and opened to where they had left off the previous week. Her voice filled the cabin, steady and clear, reading from the Book of Ruth. The words felt especially meaningful here in their mountain sanctuary. "Whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people." Jonas sat with his eyes closed, head bowed slightly. Sarah snuck glances at him between verses, noting how the lamplight softened the scars on his face. She had stopped seeing them months ago, reading instead the kindness in his eyes, the patience in his hands. The reading complete, Sarah marked their place with a thread and closed the Bible carefully. Jonas stirred, opening his eyes. "Your mother taught you to read well," he said. "She thought it important, especially the good book." Sarah stood, moving to check their supper stewing over the fire. "Said words were a gift from God, meant to be treated with respect." "Wise woman," Jonas murmured. The stew was ready, thick with dried vegetables and the last of their salted venison. Sarah filled 2 bowls, adding extra to Jonas's. He needed to regain his strength. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Sarah watched Jonas eat, noting with satisfaction that his appetite was improving. The fever had taken so much from his frame, but proper food and rest were slowly rebuilding his strength. She sent up a silent prayer of thanks for this quiet evening, for the gift of sharing bread with someone who had become more than just her savior. "Remember that first night?" Jonas asked suddenly. "When you made beans?" Sarah laughed softly. "Spilled half of them, as I recall. Still ate better than my own cooking." Jonas set his empty bowl aside. "Reckon God knew what he was doing, sending you up this mountain." The words settled warm in Sarah's chest like a benediction. She had wondered so often in those early days if she had made the right choice, begging to stay with this stern mountain man. Now she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady. Sarah cleared their bowls and added more wood to the fire. The evening stretched peaceful before them, a gift of quiet companionship neither had expected to find in this life. "Might be we should get that roof beam fixed tomorrow," Jonas said, his voice thoughtful. "If you're willing to help." Sarah recognized the question beneath his words. Not just about the beam, but about staying, about building something permanent here. Her heart swelled with gratitude. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm willing." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Sarah began humming one of her mother's hymns as she worked, her voice soft but sure. Jonas closed his eyes again, listening, and the cabin held them both in its warm embrace, father and daughter brought together by God's mysterious grace. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Sarah stood at the cabin's door, breathing in the mountain air. The past weeks had settled into a comfortable rhythm, her tending to morning chores while Jonas worked at repairing winter's damage to their home. Their home. The thought still warmed her heart. The crack of a branch caught her attention. Sarah cocked her head, listening. More sounds filtered through the trees, the distinct rhythm of approaching horses. Her heart quickened. They rarely had visitors this high up, and the railroad men's threat still echoed in her mind. "Jonas," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Riders coming." Jonas emerged from the tool shed, rifle already in hand. He moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. As they watched, 4 riders appeared through the trees. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Leading the group was her father, Clyde, his face twisted in a familiar sneer. Behind him rode 2 well-dressed men she didn't recognize, and bringing up the rear was Sheriff Thomas Avery, his badge catching the morning light. "Stay behind me," Jonas murmured, but Sarah found herself rooted to the spot as the riders drew closer. Clyde dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow. His eyes locked onto Sarah, and she felt herself shrink beneath that hateful gaze. "There's my wayward girl," he called out, voice thick with false concern. "Been worried sick about you, Sarah." "That's close enough," Jonas warned as Clyde took a step forward. The rifle in his hands made a clear statement. Sheriff Avery dismounted next, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Now, Mr. McCord, let's keep this peaceful. We're here on official business." The 2 strangers remained mounted, watching the scene unfold with calculated interest. Their fine clothes and paper-white hands marked them as railroad men, not locals. "What business?" Jonas demanded, not lowering his rifle. One of the railroad men cleared his throat. "We have serious concerns about the young lady's welfare. Her father has reported her kidnapping and unlawful detention." Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. "That's not true," she burst out. "Jonas saved me when father tried to sell me like cattle." "Now, Sarah," Clyde cut in, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "you know that was just a bit of fun. I was in my cups is all, never meant no real harm." "Mr. Clyde has legal authority over his daughter until she comes of age or is properly married," Sheriff Avery said, producing a document from his coat. "And there are witnesses to confirm that you, Mr. McCord, took her without proper consent." Jonas's jaw tightened. "I bought her fair when he put her up for auction, paid gold for it, which he was happy enough to take." "No legal record of such a transaction exists," one of the railroad men interjected smoothly. "And even if it did, the sale of persons is not recognized under territorial law." Sarah moved closer to Jonas, her hand finding the rough fabric of his coat. This couldn't be happening. This was her home now, her family. They couldn't take that away. "Furthermore," the second railroad man added, "we have concerns about the nature of your arrangement with the girl. Living alone, unmarried, in such isolation, it raises serious moral questions." Jonas's face darkened with anger. "You watch your tongue, mister. That girl's as good as my daughter." "But she ain't your daughter, is she?" Clyde sneered. "Just a man and an unmarried girl, living in sin up here in the mountains." "That's a lie," Sarah cried out, tears burning in her eyes. "Jonas has never been anything but kind and decent. He's more of a father than you ever were." Sheriff Avery sighed heavily. "Mr. McCord, I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your weapon and come with me. We'll sort this out proper-like in town." "You can't arrest him." Sarah moved to stand between Jonas and the sheriff, her heart thundering. "He's done nothing wrong." "Sarah," Jonas's voice was quiet but firm. "Step aside, girl." She turned to him, desperate. "Jonas, please don't let them do this." His weathered face was grim, but his eyes held something else, pride, mixed with sorrow. "Sometimes we got to face trouble head-on," he said softly. "Can't shoot our way out of this one." Slowly, deliberately, Jonas lowered his rifle. Sheriff Avery stepped forward with a pair of iron handcuffs. "Jonas McCord, you're under arrest for kidnapping and moral turpitude." The sheriff's voice carried official weight, but he couldn't quite meet Jonas's eyes as he secured the cuffs. Sarah felt her world crumbling. She clutched at Jonas's coat, tears flowing freely now. "No, please. You can't take him." "Stand tall, girl," Jonas told her, his voice rough with emotion. "Remember what I taught you. Stand tall." Clyde grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Come along now, daughter. Time to get you back where you belong." Sarah struggled against his grip, watching helplessly as the sheriff led Jonas to his horse. The mountain man's back was straight, his head high, even in chains. He looked back once, meeting her eyes, and in that moment she saw all the things they'd never said. His pride in her growth, his care for her welfare, his sorrow at leaving her unprotected. "Jonas!" she cried out as Clyde dragged her toward his horse. "Jonas, I'll find a way." "I promise." The railroad men watched with satisfaction as the sheriff mounted up, Jonas's hands bound to his saddle horn. Clyde roughly pushed Sarah up onto his own horse, mounting behind her. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, familiar and terrifying. "Might want to check that spring while we're up here," one of the railroad men called to his companion. "Since we made the trip and all." Sarah's tears fell hot on her hands as Clyde turned his horse toward town. Behind them, she could hear the steady hoofbeats of the sheriff's mount, carrying Jonas away from their mountain sanctuary. The morning sun seemed colder now, the familiar trees like strangers. "Told you you'd come to no good, girl," Clyde muttered in her ear as they rode. "Thinking you could play house with that killer. Well, now you'll learn your place proper." Sarah said nothing, her father's words washing over her like icy water. She kept her eyes fixed on Jonas's straight back ahead of them, remembering his words. Stand tall. Through her tears, she began to pray, not for rescue, but for strength. She would need it in the days to come. The small procession wound its way down the mountain trail, leaving behind the cabin where Sarah had finally found a home. A lone coyote called in the distance, its cry echoing off the rocks like a lament. Sarah felt each step of the horse taking her further from safety, from love, from the life she'd built with Jonas. But deep inside, beneath the fear and grief, a small flame of determination began to burn. Jonas had taught her more than just how to shoot and chop wood. He'd taught her about dignity, about standing up for what was right. As the trees thinned and the town came into view below, Sarah straightened her back. She might be in her father's power again, but she wasn't the same frightened girl he'd tried to sell months ago. She was Jonas McCord's daughter now, whether the law recognized it or not, and somehow, some way, she would find a path back to him. The thought steadied her as they descended into Silver Bluff, where curious faces already gathered to watch their return. "Stand tall," she heard Jonas's voice in her mind, and so she did, even as her heart broke with each step that carried them further apart. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered trail. Sarah watched those shadows, remembering how Jonas had taught her to read them for signs of weather and wildlife. Now they seemed to point accusingly toward town, where she knew more troubles waited. But she held on to his last words, letting them steel her spine against whatever was to come. "Stand tall, girl, stand tall." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street, as Clyde paraded Sarah through town like a prized heifer. Her legs ached from the hard ride down the mountain, but she kept her spine straight just as Jonas had taught her. Townsfolk emerged from shops and saloons drawn by the commotion of their return. "Look who's back," Clyde called out, his voice thick with whiskey and spite. "My wayward daughter, returned from her mountain hideaway." He yanked Sarah's arm, making her stumble on the rutted street. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she refused to lower her eyes this time. 6 months ago, she would have wilted under their stares. Now, something stronger lived in her heart, something Jonas had helped her find. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, clutched her shawl tight and whispered to her friend, "Poor thing looks different somehow. Living wild up there with that mountain man." "Ain't natural," her companion agreed, shaking her head. "Girl her size ought to know better than to cause such scandal." The familiar shame tried to creep in, but Sarah remembered Jonas's words from their long winter evenings. Don't let their poison into your heart, girl. Your worth ain't measured by their small minds. Clyde dragged her toward the center of town, where months ago he'd first tried to auction her off. The memory of that day felt like a lifetime ago. She was different now, stronger, braver, worth more than her father's debts. "Listen up," Clyde shouted, drawing a crowd. "Come sunrise tomorrow, I'm putting her up for proper auction this time. Any man wanting a wife, here's your chance." He waved a piece of paper. "Got it all legal and written down this time." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Clyde's fingers dug into her arm. "What did you say?" "I said no." Sarah raised her voice, letting it carry across the gathered crowd. "I'm not yours to sell." A ripple of murmurs passed through the onlookers. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, hungry for scandal. "You're my daughter," Clyde snarled, his breath hot with whiskey, "and you'll do as you're told. Being your daughter doesn't make me your property." Sarah pulled free of his grip, surprising him with her strength. Months of chopping wood and hauling water had changed more than just her spirit. Sheriff Avery stood at the edge of the crowd, his badge catching the late afternoon light. Sarah turned to him, hope flaring. "Sheriff, please! You can't let him do this. It isn't right." The sheriff shifted his weight, unable to meet her eyes. "Your father has legal authority, Sarah, and he's got papers drawn up proper this time." "Papers don't make wrong into right," Sarah said, her voice carrying clear and strong. Jonas had taught her that too, how to project without shouting, how to stand her ground without violence. "Girl's gotten above herself," someone muttered, "living alone with that killer McCord." "Jonas McCord is twice the man of any of you." Sarah wheeled to face the crowd. "He taught me my true worth when all you did was mock and judge. He showed me what family really means while you stood by and let my own father try to sell me." Clyde's face darkened with rage. He raised his hand to strike her, but Sarah didn't flinch. She'd faced down mountain storms and hungry wolves with Jonas. Her father's fury held no power over her anymore. "Strike me if you want," she said quietly. "Show everyone exactly what kind of father you are." His hand wavered, then lowered as he realized the crowd's mood had shifted. Some of the women were looking at him with open disgust now. "Get her to the boarding house," he growled to Sheriff Avery. "Keep her locked up until morning. I've got debts to settle, and by God, she'll settle them." The sheriff stepped forward, gentler than Clyde, but still firm. "Come along, Sarah. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah allowed herself to be led away, head high. As they walked, she noticed things she hadn't before. How some folks couldn't meet her eyes. How others looked thoughtful, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The boarding house room was small and stark, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the alley. Sheriff Avery checked the lock twice before leaving her alone. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said through the door. "But the law's the law." Sarah waited until his footsteps faded before sinking onto the bed. The thin mattress felt strange after months of her sturdy cot in Jonas's cabin. Everything felt wrong here. The close walls, the town sounds, the weight of judgment pressing in. As darkness crept into the room, Sarah knelt beside the bed. Jonas had never been one for lengthy prayers, but he'd taught her that honest words meant more than fancy ones. "Lord," she whispered, "I know you haven't forgotten me. Even when I felt worthless, you sent Jonas to show me different. Now he's in jail, and I'm here, and everything seems lost." She pressed her forehead against her clasped hands. "But Jonas taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified." The moon rose, casting silver light through the window. Sarah remembered nights by the cabin, learning to read tracks in the snow, to listen for wolves, to trust her own judgment. Jonas had taught her more than just survival. He'd taught her to live with dignity. "I won't be silent this time," she promised the darkness. "I won't let them treat me like property. Jonas showed me I'm worth more than that." She rose from her knees, moving to the window. The town lay quiet below, punctuated by occasional laughter from the saloon. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Jonas sat in a cell, probably worried more about her than himself. The thought straightened her spine. "I'm not that frightened girl anymore," she whispered to the moon. "I'm Jonas McCord's daughter, whether they recognize it or not." And tomorrow, they're going to hear the truth. Sarah sat on the bed, smoothing her skirts with steady hands. In her mind, she could hear Jonas's gruff voice. Truth's like water, girl. Can't stop it forever. It finds its way out. Let them lock her up tonight. Tomorrow would be soon enough to show Silver Bluff exactly who she'd become. Not just Clyde's unwanted burden, but a woman who'd learned her own worth in the high mountain silence. A daughter chosen by love rather than blood. She lay back on the thin mattress, but sleep was far from her thoughts. Instead, she practiced the words she would say, "Come morning," each phrase cleaned and sharpened like Jonas had taught her to care for his tools. The truth would be her weapon and courage her shield. Outside, a coyote called from the hills, a lonely, wavering cry that reminded her of home. Sarah closed her eyes, drawing strength from the memory of all Jonas had taught her. Tomorrow would test every lesson, every bit of confidence she'd gained. But she was ready. The night crept forward dark and uncertain, but Sarah's resolve only grew stronger with each passing hour. In the morning, they would try to sell her again, but this time, she wouldn't be a silent victim. This time she would fight for herself, for Jonas, for what was right. The moon sailed across the sky, its light painting silver patterns on the floor through the barred window. Sarah watched those patterns shift and change, her mind clear despite the late hour. Every creak of the boarding house, every distant shout from the saloon, every rattle of the night wind only strengthened her determination. She might be locked in this room, but her spirit was as free as the mountain winds. Jonas had given her that gift, the knowledge that true freedom lived in the heart first. Tomorrow, she would show them all what that meant. Sarah touched the rough wool of her dress, still carrying the scent of pine smoke from the cabin. "Stand tall," she whispered to herself, Jonas's words becoming her midnight prayer. "Stand tall." The morning sun filtered through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the packed pews. Sarah stood at the back, watching as railroad men in fine suits settled beside weather-worn miners and shopkeepers. The preacher's pulpit loomed ahead, dark wood gleaming. Clyde's grip tightened on Sarah's arm as he pushed her forward. "Here's the runaway, Preacher Wilson." His voice carried through the hushed sanctuary. "Living in sin with that mountain devil." Sarah stumbled but caught herself, remembering Jonas's words about standing tall. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way to the pulpit. Faces turned to follow her progress, some curious, others judgmental, a few showing hints of sympathy. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she climbed. Behind her, she could hear the railroad men shuffling papers, no doubt their claims to the spring. Sarah gripped the pulpit's edges, her palms damp but steady. "I ain't a runaway," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "And there's been no sin up in those mountains, only kindness and hard work." She told them everything, about Clyde selling her that August day, about Jonas offering freedom instead of bondage. Her voice grew steadier as she described learning to split wood, to hunt, to value herself. "Jonas McCord taught me what a true father should be," she said, meeting Clyde's furious gaze, "while my own father taught me only shame and fear." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Sarah turned to the railroad men. "And now you want to steal the spring that gives life to this whole valley? All for your iron rails and greed?" The whispers grew louder. Sarah saw women dabbing at their eyes, men shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even Preacher Wilson looked troubled, his earlier certainty wavering. The lead railroad man, Mr. Parker, adjusted his silk tie and stepped forward. "The girl's clearly addled from months in wilderness. This matters about legal rights, not sentiment." But Preacher Wilson rose slowly from his chair, his Bible clutched in weathered hands. "I recall the words of Amos. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." His voice strengthened. "We cannot allow greed to poison both our water and our souls." Sarah watched as Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, stood up. "That girl's kept my Johnny supplied with fresh rabbit meat all winter. Jonas McCord may be rough, but he's taught her honest work." More townsfolk joined in, their voices rising like a creek in spring thaw. "Ain't right, selling your own flesh and blood. muttered old Tom from the back pew. Seen that man stumbling drunk while his girl did all the work. Sheriff Avery shifted his weight, badge glinting in the morning light. Truth is, he admitted reluctantly, we found no signs of harm up at McCord's cabin. Place was clean, well stocked. Girl looks healthier than when she left. Clyde's face turned purple. She's mine to do with as I please. He lunged toward Sarah, fist raised, but 3 miners caught him, their calloused hands restraining his arms. Take the vote, called Preacher Wilson. Hands rose like a flock of birds taking wing, first a few, then dozens. The railroad men's documents lay forgotten on the pew. Motion carries, the preacher announced. The spring stays with Jonas McCord's claim. He turned to the sheriff. Best fetch him from jail now. The railroad men gathered their papers, faces tight with anger but unable to fight the town's clear verdict. Sarah felt tears of relief rolling down her cheeks as her neighbors surrounded her with supportive murmurs. The evening sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's Main Street as Sheriff Avery unlocked the jail cell. Jonas stepped out, his weathered face showing relief when Sarah burst through the door. She ran to him, tears streaming down her face. Pa! The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Jonas's arms wrapped around her, strong and sure. His usual gruffness melted as he held her close, one hand gently patting her back. You did good, girl. Real good. Preacher Wilson approached them, his Bible tucked under his arm. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he said, smiling warmly. Some families are bound by blood, others by something stronger, choice and love. He raised his hands in blessing over them both. May God bless this father and daughter, joined not by birth, but by his divine providence. Through the gathering dusk, they watched Clyde mount his horse, head hung low. Without a backward glance, he rode out of town, leaving only dust and bitter memories behind. The townsfolk who had gathered whispered among themselves, but their words had changed. Gone were the fearful murmurs about the dangerous mountain man. Instead, they spoke of Jonas's kindness, his protection of Sarah, his defense of the valley's water. Reckon we judged too quick, Mrs. Henderson said loud enough for all to hear. That's a good man there, and a proper father, too. The mountain snows melted, revealing tender green shoots pushing through dark soil. At Jonas's cabin, the April morning dawned crisp and full of promise. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow as she turned fresh earth for garden beds, while Jonas hammered at loose fence posts nearby. Down the winding trail came unexpected visitors, 3 young children from town, clutching small bundles, led by 2 weary-looking widows. Sarah recognized them from church, the Thompson children, whose father had died in the mine, and the Weber and Harrison widows who had lost everything in winter. We heard tell you might have room, Mrs. Weber said hesitantly. Jonas looked to Sarah, who nodded with shining eyes. There's always room, she said firmly. By sunset, the cabin hummed with new life. The children helped Sarah knead bread dough, while the widows hung curtains and arranged sleeping pallets. The small cabin transformed into something greater, a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. As evening settled over the mountains, they gathered around the rough-hewn table. Golden lamplight warmed their faces as Sarah set out fresh-baked bread. Jonas bowed his head, his voice gruff with emotion. Lord, he said, thank you for my daughter Sarah. She's the answer to prayers I didn't know to pray. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy. Here among these gathered souls, she was no longer the rejected girl from town. She was cherished, needed, home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.